The morning Rosa Sullivan stepped onto her porch to find a dead crow nailed to her door. She did not cry. She had run out of tears 2 years before, when the fire took her husband and left her face looking like a map of everything she had survived. Dry Hollow, Texas, in the year 1879 was the kind of town that kept score of other people's misfortunes the way a banker kept ledgers with precision, without mercy, and always in ink that never faded. The townspeople had been watching Rosa since the fire, cataloging her grief alongside her scars, deciding together in their whispered clusters outside the general store, and after Sunday services that a woman who had survived what Rosa Sullivan had survived must have done something to deserve it. The crow was simply the latest installment of their verdict. Rosa pulled the bird free from the nail with her bare hands. She did not flinch. She carried it around to the back of her property, past the small vegetable garden she tended with dogged precision, past the chicken coop that held 7 hens and a rooster named Theodore, and she buried the crow under the old cottonwood tree at the edge of her land. She said a few words over it, because it was not the crow's fault that people were cruel, and then she washed her hands at the pump and went inside to make her coffee. She was 28 years old. She had brown hair that she kept in a practical braid, because the left side of her neck was scarred in a way that made loose hair uncomfortable. The scar ran from just below her left ear, down the side of her jaw, and fanned across her collarbone like a river delta drawn in pale, puckered skin. Her left hand was scarred at the fingers too, from where she had grabbed at burning timbers trying to reach her husband, Thomas, who had already been beyond reaching. Her right hand was perfect and steady, and she used it to pour her coffee with the same deliberate grace she used for everything. Thomas Sullivan had been dead for 2 years and 4 months. He had been 31 when the fire claimed him, a good man, a quiet man who had loved his horses and his wife in equal measure, and had died trying to save his mare from the burning stable while the house caught at the same time. Rosa had gotten out. Thomas had not. That was the whole brutal arithmetic of it, and the town of Dry Hollow had decided, in its collective wisdom, that Rosa must be cursed, because no good woman lost a husband like that and lived to tell about it. She ignored them as much as she was able. She had 40 acres of land that Thomas had left her, a small herd of cattle she managed with the help of a hired hand named Old Pete Garza who came 3 days a week, her garden, her chickens, and a stubbornness that was, if she was being honest, the primary thing that had kept her breathing through the worst of it. She did not go into town more than necessary. She did not sit in the pew at First Baptist anymore because the minister had once suggested from the pulpit, in language careful enough to be deniable, that the Lord sometimes sent trials to those whose faith required purification. Rosa had stood up, walked out the door, and had not returned. It was the 3rd week of October when the new man arrived in Dry Hollow. She heard about him before she saw him, because that was how small towns worked. Old Pete told her on a Wednesday morning, while he was mending the north fence line, that a stranger had ridden in the day before and taken the room above the feed store from Mr. Aldridge. The stranger had arrived alone, on a big gray horse with a white blaze, carrying a rifle, 2 saddlebags, and what appeared to be a considerable quantity of books, which had occasioned much comment among the men loitering outside the Dusty Boot saloon. "They say he come from out east somewhere," Pete said, hammering a staple into the post. "Doesn't look like a drifter. Looks like a man with something on his mind." Rosa had nodded and gone back to checking the water trough, and she had given the stranger no more thought than that. She met Cecil Collier 4 days later on a Saturday afternoon when she drove her wagon into town for flour, salt, coffee, and a new length of rope. She was tying off her horse outside Caldwell's general store when she heard the argument. It was coming from the alley alongside the store. 2 of the Marsh brothers, local troublemakers who had always existed at the uncomfortable edge between nuisance and genuine danger, had a younger man backed against the wall. The younger man was not particularly large, but he was holding himself with a stillness that Rosa recognized as the studied calm of someone who had decided not to be afraid. "You are in the wrong alley at the wrong time," the older Marsh brother, Dale, was saying. His younger brother Hector was circling around to the side. "That seems like it might be your problem more than mine," the man against the wall said, in a voice that was moderate and unhurried. "I'm not carrying much worth stealing, and I'm not interested in a fight. But I want you to know clearly that the two of you combined don't change that calculus in my favor quite as much as you seem to think." Rosa did not make a deliberate decision. She simply found herself walking into the alley, holding her supply list in one hand, and saying in her clearest voice, "Dale Marsh, your mother is looking for you. She sent word to the store that your father's back went out again, and she needs the woodpile stacked before nightfall." This was completely fabricated, but it was also specific enough and delivered with enough authority that Dale turned around with an expression of genuine uncertainty. He looked at Rosa, registered who she was, and the sneer that crossed his face was the particular sneer that people in Dry Hollow used when they saw her. But his brother had already lowered his hands, made suddenly hesitant by the interruption. "That's none of your business, which," Dale said. "Probably not," Rosa agreed pleasantly. "But it will be your mother's business when she finds out you were out here instead of where she needed you. You can explain it to her." The Marsh brothers exchanged a look, the kind that brothers exchange when they have been outmaneuvered in a way they cannot quite articulate, and then Dale made a sound of contempt and walked out of the alley, his brother following. Rosa waited until their footsteps had faded, and then she turned to the man against the wall. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on a man's face in 2 years and was not immediately prepared for. It was not pity, which was what men usually showed her. It was not the complicated revulsion-curiosity mixture she had come to recognize from strangers seeing her scars for the first time. It was something closer to frank interest, the kind of look that said he was seeing her, not her scars, not her story, but her, and finding what he saw worth looking at. He was perhaps 30, with dark hair worn somewhat longer than was fashionable, a lean face with strong bones, and the kind of eyes that were hazel in one light and nearly green in another. He wore a clean shirt and a vest that had seen better days, and there was dust on his boots from the road, but he was clean-shaven and had the look of a man who maintained himself out of personal pride rather than vanity. He had a rifle on his back and a pistol at his hip in the way that most men in the territory did in 1879, which was simply practical rather than threatening. "Cecil Collier," he said, and held out his hand. "Rosa Sullivan," she said, and shook it. He did not hold her left hand differently when he shook it, did not avoid the scarred fingers or be overly careful with them. He just shook her hand like it was her hand. "I appreciate the rescue," he said. "It wasn't a rescue. They would have gotten tired of you eventually." "That is almost certainly true," he said, "but your method was faster and more elegant. Are you in a hurry? I was about to get a cup of coffee at the hotel and I'd like to buy you one as a thank you." She looked at him steadily. She had learned to look at people steadily because looking away was a habit she had decided not to indulge. "The hotel coffee is terrible," she said. "I have no doubt. But it's the only coffee available, which means it's still technically coffee." She almost smiled. It surprised her, the almost smile. It felt unfamiliar in a way that made her aware of how long it had been. "I have things I need to get from the store," she said. "I'll help carry them, then coffee." She was not certain why she agreed. Later she would think about it and decide it was because he had not asked about her face, and he had not offered her sympathy, and he had spoken to her the way one person speaks to another person and not the way Dry Hollow spoke to Rosa Sullivan. It was a small thing. It was, at that moment, an enormous thing. They went into Caldwell's together, and Rosa collected her flour, her salt, her coffee, and her rope. Mr. Caldwell served her with his usual expression of restrained discomfort, which had been his expression since the fire. Cecil Collier stood beside her and made conversation with Mr. Caldwell about the price of feed grain with the easy manner of a man who knew how to talk to people without effort. and Mr. Caldwell visibly relaxed in a way he had never quite managed with Rosa alone, which told her something about the weight she still carried in this town. They loaded her wagon and then walked to the Dry Hollow Hotel, where the coffee was indeed terrible, and they sat at a corner table and drank it. She asked him what had brought him to Dry Hollow, because she was a practical woman and she preferred direct questions to circling. He told her he had been a surveyor for a land company out of San Antonio, but the company had folded 8 months ago when its primary investor died, and he had spent the intervening time doing whatever work presented itself, helping with a cattle drive-up from the Rio Grande, some repair work at a ranch outside Laredo, a stint helping a schoolteacher in a small town near the Colorado River move, and organize a library that she had personally transported from Cincinnati. He had come to Dry Hollow because Pete Garza's cousin had mentioned in a conversation on the road that there might be work on a widow's ranch north of town. Rosa set down her coffee cup. "Pete Garza's cousin told you about me. He said there was a ranch that needed work and that the owner was a capable woman who was having trouble getting reliable help. He didn't mention," he stopped. "My scars," she said. She said it the way she said everything direct without softening it. He met her eyes. "He mentioned them, actually. He said the town had a story about you that wasn't fair and that you were good people who deserved better than what you were getting." Rosa absorbed this. Pedro Garza, Pete's cousin who drove freight between Laredo and San Antonio, had apparently been advocating for her without her knowledge. She made a mental note to thank Pete. "I'm not an easy employer," she said. "I have opinions about how things should be done and I am not shy about expressing them." "That sounds like the best kind of employer," Cecil said. "I can pay a fair wage, not extravagant but fair. There's a bunkhouse on the property. It's small but sound." "When can I start?" She looked at him for a moment. She was not a woman who made decisions hastily, but she was also not a woman who let caution become an excuse for not living. She could see something in Cecil Collier that she trusted her instincts to identify without being able to fully name yet, a steadiness, a quality of attention, a certain moral weight that some people carried and most people didn't. "Monday morning," she said. "Be there at sunrise." He was there at sunrise. He arrived with his 2 saddlebags, and the rifle and a stack of 4 books tied together with a leather strap, and he tied his gray horse in the stable and looked around the property with the careful eye of a man who was actually looking and not just appearing to, and he asked her what she needed most urgently. She took him through everything methodically: the north fence, the south pasture drainage ditch that had been silting up for a season, the stable roof that had 3 boards needing replacement, the pump at the far pasture that was losing pressure. He worked the way she had hoped he would, without theater, without unnecessary commentary, without waiting to be told twice. He figured out problems on his own when she was not nearby, and showed her his solutions at the end of the day with the matter-of-fact presentation of someone who was confident in his reasoning, but not arrogant about it. He worked alongside Pete Garza on Pete's days without any of the friction that could develop between men when one felt his position was being encroached upon. And Pete, who had known Rosa for years and was protective of her, gave Cecil a measured and gradual approval that Rosa found more reassuring than any enthusiastic endorsement would have been. He ate dinner at her kitchen table on the second day because she made too much stew and said so, and it would be wasteful. He thanked her and ate without self-consciousness and helped with the washing up afterward, and then went out to the bunkhouse. She stood at the kitchen window and watched the lamp light come on in the small bunkhouse window and felt something that she did not immediately name. The town noticed, naturally. Small towns always noticed. Margaret Aldridge, who ran the boarding house and had an opinion about everything and everyone, came to see Rosa on a Thursday under the pretext of returning a borrowed pie tin, a pretext so thin as to be nearly transparent, since Rosa had not lent Margaret Aldridge a pie tin, and they both knew it. She sat in Rosa's kitchen and drank tea and told Rosa, with the elaborate concern of someone delivering a warning they were actually enjoying, that people were talking about the new man out at Sullivan's place. "They're welcome to talk," Rosa said and refilled Margaret's cup. "It doesn't look proper," Margaret said. "A widow woman with a single man living on her property." "He lives in the bunkhouse," Rosa said. "All the same, people are—" Margaret paused in a way designed to be significant. "People remember what happened to Thomas, Rosa. They worry." "They worried about Thomas when he was alive," Rosa said. "They worry about his absence now that he's gone." "Their capacity for worry on my behalf seems remarkably consistent regardless of my actual circumstances. But thank you, Margaret. I'll be sure to let you know if anything changes." Margaret left somewhat deflated, and Rosa went back to the books she kept for the ranch, and she was aware that her jaw was set in the way it set when she was irritated and forcing herself to be calm about it. What she did not say to Margaret, what she would not have said to anyone in Dry Hollow yet, was that something was happening in her kitchen over the dinners that had become a nightly habit, and something was happening in the evenings on the porch when Cecil sat on the top step, and she sat in the rocking chair, and they talked about everything and nothing, and she was paying close attention to it because she did not trust herself to move too quickly towards something that felt as warm as this felt. They talked about books. He had read widely and eclectically, which she had also, and this turned out to be a foundation for the kind of conversation that could go anywhere and frequently did. He had opinions that he held firmly but revised when confronted with a compelling argument, which she found more attractive than she had anticipated. He was curious about everything: the way she managed her cattle rotation, the history of the land before she and Thomas had come to it, the geological character of the hills to the north, the plant life in the pasture, the personality of each of her 7 hens. She told him about Theodore the rooster one night, how Theodore had survived the fire by sheer bloody-mindedness, having been locked in the coop at the far end of the property, and how she had found him the morning after standing in the ash-covered yard, making noise at the sky, with an indignation that had seemed, at the time, to be the most appropriate available response to everything that had happened. Cecil had laughed at that, a real, full laugh that startled the dog who had appeared from somewhere in the previous week and begun living on Rosa's porch, and the sound of it had done something complicated and warm to Rosa's chest. She told him about Thomas, too. Not all at once, but gradually in pieces, the way you dismantle something that needs to be moved carefully. Thomas's patience with difficult horses, the way he had sung badly and cheerfully while doing chores, the quality of the silence he had been able to offer when she needed quiet, the fire, what she remembered of it, which was a great deal, and what she did not remember, which was the part she was sometimes grateful for. Cecil listened to all of it with the attention he brought to everything, complete, without interruption, without the anxious helpfulness that most people brought to other people's grief, as if pain were something that needed to be fixed quickly before it became inconvenient. He just listened, and when she was finished talking he was quiet for a moment and then said, "He sounds like he was a genuinely good man." "He was," she said. "I was lucky to have him." "You were," Cecil said, "and he was lucky to have you. Those both seem like they can be true." She looked at him in the dim lantern light on the porch and thought that this was a man who understood that love was not erased by loss, that it sat alongside the loss like a second landscape, and that this understanding, which seemed so simple, was in fact quite rare. November came in cold and dry, with a blue sky that was almost violent in its clarity and a wind that had teeth. The cattle needed moving to the south pasture. The well near the bunkhouse began showing signs of needing attention. Cecil fixed both problems with Pete's help, and Rosa watched them work from across the yard, and she was watching Cecil specifically, and she knew it and she let herself know it. He caught her looking one afternoon, and he did not look away. He held her gaze across the yard for a long moment with an expression that was careful and clear, and said, without any words at all, that he was watching her too, and he was not going to pretend he wasn't. Then he went back to what he was doing, and Rosa went back to what she was doing, and the air between them for the rest of that day had a different quality, charged and honest and slightly terrifying. He asked her to walk with him on a Sunday afternoon, when the work that could not wait had been done, and there was a clear, cold hour of daylight left. They walked to the cottonwood tree at the edge of her property, the one she had buried the crow under, and he had somehow already known about the crow because Pete had told him. And he stood under the tree and looked at the country spreading out around them, the ochre and rust of the October-brown grass, the limestone hills going blue in the late light, the enormous Texas sky doing everything it always did. And he said, "This is beautiful country." "It is," she said. "I understand why you stayed." She considered this. People thought I should sell after the fire, move on, go back east, go somewhere more comfortable. And you thought what? I thought that running from a place is not the same as healing from what happened there. And I thought that 40 acres is 40 acres, and I had worked for mine. She paused. And I thought that I was not going to let this town drive me out. He turned from the view to look at her, and the afternoon light was doing something specific to his face that made it difficult for her to maintain the careful neutrality she had been practicing. "That sounds exactly right to me," he said. "Does it?" "Yes." He looked at her for another moment. "Rosa, I want to ask you something, and I want you to feel free to tell me it's none of my business, because it is entirely possible that it isn't." "Ask," she said. "Are you happy here? Not happy in the way that gets compared to other options or happy relative to what happened. Just are you happy?" Nobody had asked her this, not in 2 years. They had asked how she was managing. They had asked if she needed anything. They had asked with varying degrees of delicacy when she was planning to sell. Nobody had asked this particular question in this particular simple way. She thought about it honestly, the way she thought about all things without decoration. "I am getting there," she said finally. "There are days when I am genuinely glad to be here. There are days when the grief is still heavier than everything else. But the ratio is shifting." And lately she stopped. "Lately," he said, in a voice that was very quiet, "lately there have been evenings on the porch that I look forward to, which is something I hadn't expected." The silence that followed was full and warm, and neither of them broke it for a while. The wind moved through the cottonwood leaves, and the sky turned deeper blue above them, and somewhere back at the ranch Theodore was making his opinion about something known to the world. Cecil said, "I came to Dry Hollow thinking I would stay a month, maybe 2, and then move on to the next place. I do that. I have been doing that for 5 years. I don't have a particularly good reason for it except that nothing has ever given me a reason to stop. And now," she said, he looked at the country again and then at her, "now I find myself thinking about what the north fence looks like in spring, what the garden looks like when things start coming up, what Theodore does when it's warm enough to be ridiculous." He paused. "What the porch evenings look like when it's not quite so cold." Rosa was quiet for a moment. The light was going from gold to the soft gray-purple of winter dusk. "You should know," she said carefully, "that this town thinks I'm cursed. They've thought so since the fire. There was a crow nailed to my door last month. Pete told me. Then you know what staying would mean. People they would say things." "I expect they would," he said. He turned to face her fully with the directness that was his primary characteristic. "Rosa, I want to be honest with you about something. I don't care what this town thinks. I am not unaware that this is easy to say and harder to live with in practice, and I don't want to minimize what it would cost you to have more to deal with than you already do. But from where I stand, the opinion of people who nail dead birds to a woman's door and drive her out of church has a value I can comfortably disregard." She looked at him for a long moment. "You are very direct," she said. "I try to be," he said. "Does that trouble you?" "No," she said. "It does not trouble me at all." She did not let him kiss her that evening, though she thought about it. She thought about it with the particular awareness of a woman who had not let herself think about such things for 2 years, and she recognized the awareness as something alive and returning to her, something she had believed might be permanently lost. She went inside when the dark came fully, and she sat at her kitchen table with her hands around a cup of coffee, and she thought about Cecil Collier with his books and his steady hands and his green hazel eyes and his laugh that startled the porch dog. and she acknowledged to herself with the honesty she required of herself in all things that she was in serious trouble. She was also, for the first time in a long time, glad about it. The next 2 weeks were a particular kind of sweet torture that Rosa recognized as the middle distance of something beginning. Cecil was careful with her, not in the way that people were careful with fragile things, which she loathed, but in the way that a person is careful with something they genuinely value, taking their time, being deliberate. He found small reasons to be near her. He learned the rhythm of her days and slipped alongside it without disrupting it. He fixed the pump at the far pasture, and then came to find her to tell her it was done, when he could simply have told Pete. And he stood in the garden while she turned over the beds for winter, and listened to her talk about what she planned to plant come spring, with the kind of attention that said he was listening because she was saying it, and not because the garden itself particularly required his expertise. He read to her one evening. She had mentioned a book she had been having trouble getting through, a history of the Western Territories, with dense passages that required more patience than she could always muster at the end of a working day. And he had picked it up from where it sat on the shelf and said, "May I?" And when she nodded, he had sat in the chair by the fire and read 3 chapters aloud in a voice that was moderate and clear and occasionally amused, when the author's pretensions got the better of his prose. She had fallen asleep in the rocking chair halfway through the 3rd chapter, which she was only aware of because she woke up to find a blanket over her, and the fire banked low and a note on the table in a handwriting that was careful and angular. "Good night, Rosa. The south gate is latched." She had sat there in the quiet for a long time, holding the note, feeling something that she chose not to name yet, but that sat in her chest like a small, steady light. The town of Dry Hollow was not being quiet about its feelings. Rosa heard reports from various sources. From Pete, who heard things while making his rounds. From a woman named Adele Ruiz who ran the laundry, and who was one of Rosa's few actual friends in town, and who had enough plain sense to understand that a widow keeping company with a decent man was not, in fact, a sign of moral collapse. And from the air itself, which in small towns carries information with remarkable efficiency. The consensus in Dry Hollow was that the scarred widow was making a mistake, or possibly that the scarred widow was inflicting herself on an innocent man, depending on which version of the theory you preferred. The Reverend Hollies, who had replaced the minister Rosa had walked out on, stopped Cecil outside the hardware store on a cold November morning, and explained to him at some length that the Sullivan widow was not a woman a man of sense and decency ought to attach himself to, given the history. Cecil listened to the Reverend Hollies with the patience of a man who had been raised to be respectful to members of the clergy, and had decided, somewhere along the way, that this respect had limits. When the Reverend Hollies finished, Cecil said, "I appreciate you telling me your concerns. I want to be honest with you, Reverend. I have gotten to know Rosa Sullivan over the past several weeks, and she is the most capable, honest, and genuinely decent person I have met in 5 years of traveling, and I find I am not particularly troubled by the stories the town tells about her." The Reverend Holly said he hoped Cecil would reflect on this more carefully. Cecil said he was sure he would, and went into the hardware store. He told Rosa about it that evening, not to alarm her, but because he had decided early that he was not going to keep things from her on the grounds that they might be upsetting. She listened with her hands folded in her lap and her expression composed in the way she composed it when she was feeling something she was choosing not to perform publicly. "He'll make trouble," she said, "probably. For you specifically. People are easier on the newcomer at first because they want to be liked by newcomers. Once they decide you're committed to something they disapprove of, they shift." "I know that," he said. "I don't want," she started again. "I don't want you to take on this town's weight on my account, Cecil. I've been carrying it for 2 years. I know how it sits. It's not light." He leaned forward from his chair. The firelight was between them, and it made the lines of his face warm and serious. "Rosa," he said, "I want you to hear me say something clearly. I'm not doing this from obligation or charity or some sense that you need protecting. I'm doing this because he paused, and she could see him choosing his words with the same care he brought to everything structural. Because when I imagine leaving this place, leaving this ranch, I feel the specific absence of you. Not just in general, the way you miss a place you've been comfortable, your particular absence. That is a feeling I've never had before, and I intend to follow it. Rosa was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the wind was working on the plains with its November authority, and Theodore had long since gone to roost, and the porch dog was curled against the door, and everything was still. "Cecil," she said. "Yes. Come here." He moved from his chair and crossed to her, and when she took his face in both hands, her right hand and her scarred left hand, and kissed him, she did it with the full deliberateness of a woman who had made a decision and was not making it lightly. He kissed her back with the same quality, careful and complete and entirely genuine. When she pulled back, she looked at him for a moment and then laughed, a real, unpracticed laugh that surprised her because it was good, because it was simply, unexpectedly, undeniably good. "I have been wanting to do that for 3 weeks," she said. 4 weeks, he said. "From my end, it's been 4 weeks. You're going to be insufferable about the arithmetic, aren't you?" "Almost certainly," he said, and smiled at her. And the smile was the one that reached his eyes in a specific way she had catalogued without meaning to, and she thought she could probably look at it for a very long time without tiring of it. December came, and with December came the full force of what the town was going to do about Rosa Sullivan and Cecil Collier. It started with small things. Cecil went to Caldwell's for supplies and found his credit had been declined without explanation, Caldwell looking at his boots and mumbling about policies. The hired man from the Aldridge farm who had been coming out occasionally to help with heavy work suddenly stopped coming, with no message given. 2 of Rosa's cattle turned up with their ears cut in a way that she had never seen before, not predators, clearly deliberate, done with a knife. Rosa stood over those cattle and felt something cold and controlled move through her. She did not panic, she did not cry, she assessed. Then she went inside and sat at the table with Cecil and Pete, and they discussed what was being communicated and what the response should be. "This is the Marsh brothers," Pete said flatly. "Dale Marsh has a mouth and no sense, and he's been riling things up." "The ear cutting is a statement," Cecil said. He was controlled, but Rosa could see the set of his jaw. "It's meant to frighten." "It won't," Rosa said. "I know," he said. "I'm telling you what it's meant to do, not what it will accomplish." She went to the sheriff, a man named Beaumont Harp who had held the office for 6 years, and who was neither corrupt nor particularly courageous. The particular combination that produced a law enforcement official who maintained surface order while declining to engage with anything that would cost him political comfort. Sheriff Harp listened to Rosa describe the ear-notching of her cattle, wrote something in a notebook, and told her he would make inquiries. His tone strongly suggested that the inquiries would be superficial. Rosa thanked him with perfect courtesy, because she had learned that perfect courtesy was an effective weapon when delivered into a face that expected anger. She went from the sheriff's office to the laundry, where Adele Ruiz was pressing shirts and listening. Adele was 42 and had come to Texas from Sonora, Mexico 20 years ago with her husband, who had died of fever 6 years past, and had stayed because the laundry was hers, and she had built it herself, and she was not leaving. She understood the particular experience of being a woman alone in a frontier town in a way that required no explanation between her and Rosa. She pressed shirts and listened to all of it and then said, "You know what you need." "Tell me," Rosa said. "You need witnesses. You need people who will say plainly on the record that they see what is happening to you and they believe it. Not because they can go to court, Harp won't do anything, but because it changes the atmosphere. The Marsh brothers are cowards. Cowards operate best in the dark." Rosa thought about this. "Who?" she said. Adele set down the iron and looked at her. "You have more people on your side than you know. You stay out there on that ranch and you don't let anyone in, and so you don't know. Let me talk to some people." It took a week and it looked like this. On a Sunday afternoon, 6 people rode out to Rosa's ranch without announcement. Adele came. Henry Flowers, who ran the barber shop, came, bringing his wife Clara. Old Pete Garza came, having apparently organized his part of it independently. A farmer named Silas Webb, who had bought land 3 miles north and had no patience for the Marsh brothers because of a fence dispute the previous year, came with his wife Alina. And a woman named Betsy Cole, who taught school in Dry Hollow and who had always believed that what the town did to Rosa Sullivan was wrong, came alone on a fine brown mare. They arrived together, and Rosa stood on her porch and watched them come, and Cecil came out of the stable and stood beside her, and Pete raised his hand from horseback in greeting, and Rosa felt something move in her chest that was warm and complicated. They stayed for coffee and they talked plainly. Henry Flowers said he had told Dale Marsh directly that the next time Dale made derogatory remarks about Rosa Sullivan in his barber shop, Dale would find himself cutting his own hair. Silas Webb said that he had watched what this town did to Rosa for 2 years, and he was ashamed. It had taken him this long to say so out loud. Betsy Cole said that she had written a letter to the county seat, to the actual county sheriff rather than the local one, documenting what had been happening to Rosa's property. Rosa sat in her kitchen surrounded by these people, and she did not cry, but it was an effort. She had been alone in this for a long time. Not alone in the sense of not having Cecil or Pete, those two had become pillars, but alone in the broader sense of having a town turned against her. This small congregation of people sitting in her kitchen with their coffee cups was not the whole town, and the whole town had not changed its mind, and Dale Marsh was still out there with his knife and his grievances. But it was something. It was people choosing plainly to be on her side, which was a different thing from simply not being against her. Cecil caught her eye from across the table, and the look that passed between them was private and complete, and carried the full weight of the last 2 months in it. After the guests had gone and Pete had returned to town, Cecil sat with Rosa on the porch in the cold December dark, and the porch dog was between them with his head on Rosa's knee, and the stars over the Texas plain were remarkable in the way that they always were when you had enough dark and enough space to let them perform. "I want to stay," Cecil said, "not as hired help. I want you to know what I'm saying when I say I want to stay." She was quiet for a moment. The stars moved in their imperceptible way. "I know what you're saying," she said. "Is it too soon?" She thought about that honestly. It was December. He had arrived in October. It was fast, she knew it was fast. But she also knew that she was 28 years old, and she had already learned, at considerable cost, that time was not a thing to be wasted on excessive waiting. She also knew that she was not the woman she had been before the fire, who might have required longer to be certain. The fire had burned away a great deal, some of it terrible to lose, and some of it, she had come to understand, useful to lose. One of the things it had burned away was her capacity for self-deception about what she wanted and what she felt. She looked at Cecil Collier and she knew precisely what she felt. She had known for weeks. "It's not too soon," she said, "but I want to say something." "Say it," he said. "I'm not the same as I was before Thomas died. I'm not saying this as a warning, I'm saying it as a fact. The woman I was before was softer in some ways, easier. I've gotten harder in some places, in ways that I think are good, and harder in some places that are not entirely useful. I will have bad days that have nothing to do with you. I have ghosts that I don't think will ever be entirely quiet. I am not a simple proposition." He was quiet for a moment, and she saw him consider his response with the seriousness it deserved. "Rosa," he said, "I've spent 5 years moving from place to place because nothing was right enough to stop for. I'm 31 years old, and I've been careful about where I put my feet because I've been afraid of building something in the wrong place again." He paused, and she heard the again, but did not ask about it yet, knowing it was a door he would open when he was ready. "You are not a simple proposition. Neither am I. But I think we are the same particular kind of complicated, and I think that means something." She thought about this for a moment. Then she said, Then we will figure it out as we go. That's all I'm asking for, he said. The winter of 1879 into 1880 was hard in the way that West Texas winters could be hard, not always cold, but unpredictable and demanding, with stretches of bitter freeze followed by warm, muddy days that made the roads impassable in their own way. Cecil stayed. He was present in her days and her evenings and her kitchen table conversations with the completeness of someone who had decided he was somewhere and was not hovering on the threshold waiting to see whether he would be invited in further. He began fixing things that had needed fixing for longer than the time he had been there. Things Thomas had meant to get to and things that had accumulated in the 2 years since. He rebuilt the stable roof completely, not just the 3 boards but the whole structure, with Pete's help and Sela's Webb's help on the 2 heaviest days. He improved the drainage on the south pasture in a way that changed how the cattle were able to use it. He planted a second garden bed behind the house in a configuration he had worked out from a reference in one of his books, and when spring came it would be planted with things he had already written away for, seeds from a catalog he had sent to a merchant in San Antonio. He moved his things into the house on a cold Saturday in January, and this was how it happened. He said, over breakfast, that the bunkhouse was cold enough that he was having trouble with the ink in his pen, which made correspondence difficult, and that there was an empty room in the house he had noticed, and would she have a practical objection to his using it. She looked at him over her coffee and saw that the bunkhouse being cold was true, and that this was also not really about the bunkhouse at all, and she said, "The room is yours," and that was that. He moved his saddlebags and his 4 books, and then 3 more books that had arrived by mail and a small wooden chest she had not seen before, and he set his things in the room at the back of the house that had been a sewing room in Thomas's time and had been empty since, and she watched him do it with an awareness that something was being made. Something was being built, deliberately and carefully, by 2 people with their eyes open. The town, of course, erupted. Margaret Aldridge came back with her invisible pie tin and an expression of genuine moral horror. The Reverend Hollies made a visit that Cecil handled with impeccable courtesy and absolute immovability. 3 women who had never spoken to Rosa directly began speaking to her indirectly through the social mechanisms of small towns, notes delivered through intermediaries, pointed silences at the general store, the conspicuous avoidance that functioned as its own kind of commentary. And Dale Marsh, predictably, took things further. He and 2 other men, not his brother this time but a pair of drifters he had apparently found and hired for something, which cost money and indicated a level of seriousness that troubled Rosa, showed up at the property line one evening at dusk, just far enough from the house to be technically outside trespassing, and made their presence known in the way that men like Dale Marsh made their presence known. Loudly, with intention. Cecil was the one who walked out to meet them. Rosa was behind him, and she had her rifle because she was not a woman who left her rifle in the house when there were drifters at her property line, and Pete Garza had materialized from somewhere. She suspected he had heard something in town that had brought him out here today specifically, and old Pete had his own rifle. Cecil walked to within speaking distance of Dale Marsh and said, in the moderate, unhurried voice he used for everything, "You're going to tell me what you want, and then you're going to go. Those are the 2 options available to you." Dale said several things that were not worth reproducing, the sum of which was that Rosa Sullivan was not welcome in this territory, and that men who attached themselves to cursed women became cursed themselves. Cecil said, "Then I suppose we're cursed together. Are we done?" Something about the flatness of it, the complete absence of fear or drama, seemed to deflate Dale Marsh in a way that Rosa could see from 20 feet back. Bullies, she had come to understand, required a particular kind of response. Not the fear that fed them, and not the righteous fury that gave them an opponent to perform against, but the plain refusal to find them interesting. Cecil did not find Dale Marsh interesting. He made this evident without effort. Dale said one more thing, turned his horse and rode away. The drifters followed, having said nothing, which suggested they had been paid for presence rather than action and were not inclined to provide more than they had contracted for. Pete lowered his rifle and let out a breath that was almost a laugh. "That man," Pete said, shaking his head. Rosa walked up to stand beside Cecil. He glanced at her. "Are you all right?" he said. "Perfectly," she said. He nodded. He was steady. She could see that he was steady all the way through, not performing calm but actually feeling it, or at least managing it in a way that amounted to the same thing. She put her hand on his arm briefly and felt him let out a slow breath under her hand, and understood that the steadiness had cost him something, and he was letting himself acknowledge it now that it was over. The letter to the county sheriff, the one Betsy Cole had sent, produced a result in February. A county deputy named Ruiz, no relation to Adele, rode into Dry Hollow and conducted interviews with a thoroughness that surprised everyone who had been counting on the situation remaining comfortably ambiguous. He interviewed Rosa. He interviewed Cecil. He interviewed Pete and Silas Webb and Adele and Betsy Cole. He interviewed Sheriff Harp at length, and the quality of that particular interview, which had been observed through the window of the sheriff's office by half the town, appeared to have been instructive. He interviewed Dale Marsh, who denied everything with the confidence of a man who had always found denial effective. What followed was not a trial. There was not sufficient evidence for that. But the deputy's written report to the county created an official record, one that Dale Marsh and the Reverend Hollies and Margaret Aldridge now knew existed, and the existence of that record changed the calculation. The anonymous harassment that depended on deniability was less comfortable when someone official had written your name down in connection with a pattern of behavior. The dead bird stopped. The deliberate avoidance at the general store shifted, not to warmth, but to a neutrality that was at least livable with. The Reverend Hollies ceased his direct campaign against Cecil and confined himself to disapproving silences, which Rosa could tolerate without difficulty. Dry Hollow did not become a kind town. It had never been a kind town, and she had no illusions about that. But the pressure eased. The weight shifted. She could breathe in a way that was slightly different from how she had been breathing. Spring came in March with the extravagance that West Texas springs could manage. A brief, insistent, spectacularly colored explosion of wildflowers across the plain that lasted 3 weeks, and then gave way to the heat of summer. But while it lasted, it was so vivid and so alive that it required you to be present for it, whether you had planned to be or not. Cecil stood in the pasture one morning, surrounded by bluebonnets and Indian paintbrush and primrose going orange in the morning light, and looked at it with an expression that Rosa, watching him from the fence, recognized as a man who had realized something. She walked out to him, and he turned to look at her with that expression still on his face. "I want to marry you," he said. Not asking exactly, but not demanding either, stating something that he had arrived at, and was now presenting to her with the same directness he brought to everything. "I have wanted to say that for a month, and I have been waiting until it felt like the right moment, and I think this is the right moment. But I am also aware that the right moment is somewhat undermined by the fact that I am standing in a field that currently looks like something from a story, and that this may seem premeditated." Rosa looked at him for a moment. The bluebonnets moved in the mild spring wind. The sky was that particular transparent blue. "It does seem premeditated," she said. "It isn't. I genuinely just arrived at it and decided to say it." "I know," she said. "I believe you. Is that a yes?" She walked closer to him and took his face in both her hands, her right hand and her scarred left hand, the one that she had long since stopped apologizing for, and looked at him with the full, clear attention she gave to things she was certain about. "Yes," she said. "It is absolutely yes." He kissed her in the field of bluebonnets, and the spring morning went all around them with its colors and its wind, and she felt something settle in her that had been unsettled for a very long time, not erased, not replaced, but resolved, the way a chord that has been building resolves, and the resolution was good and true and hers. They were married in April. in a ceremony that was performed not by the Reverend Hollies, who was not asked, but by a justice of the peace named Amos Garrett, who rode out from the county seat, and who was a practical, amiable man with no particular opinion about Rosa Sullivan's history. The guests were few and the right people. Adele Ruiz, who cried and did not apologize for it. Pete Garza, who wore his best shirt and shook Cecil's hand for so long that Cecil laughed. Betsy Cole, who had written the letter that changed things. Henry and Clara Flowers, Silas and Alina Webb. They held the ceremony outside in the pasture because the wildflowers were still going and Cecil had wanted it outside, and Rosa had thought this was right. The sky was high and clear, and the wind was present but not troublesome, and Theodore the rooster contributed his opinion from the chicken coop at what he apparently judged to be appropriate intervals, which made the assembled guests laugh. The porch dog, who had been formally named Jerome by Cecil in the winter after a period of patient negotiation over what the dog's name should be, lay in the sunshine and appeared satisfied with events. Amos Garrett read the words of the ceremony in a voice that was clear and unhurried, and Rosa said her part of it looking at Cecil with the steady directness she brought to all things, and Cecil said his part of it looking at her the same way. And when it was done, she was Rosa Collier and he was her husband, and the land around them was theirs. The reception was in the kitchen and spilled onto the porch, and Adele had brought food enough for 3 times the number of people present, which was Adele's way of saying something she wouldn't say directly, and Pete had apparently consulted someone about what was appropriate to drink at a wedding, and had arrived with a bottle of something that was, he claimed, very good, though Rosa privately suspected Pete's definition of very good was reasonably elastic. It was the best afternoon Rosa had spent in years. She sat on the porch step with Cecil's shoulder against hers in the late afternoon gold light, and watched her small community of people fill her yard and talk and eat and laugh, and she felt the complexity of it, the shadow of Thomas still there, still real, because love did not evaporate with a person's death and she would not want it to, and alongside that shadow, the full, present, vivid warmth of what was currently happening, which was good and right and real in its own way, and did not diminish what had come before. She leaned her head briefly against Cecil's shoulder, and he turned his face and pressed a kiss to her hair, and Adele caught this from across the yard and made a face of unrestrained approval that made Rosa laugh. They settled into being married the way people settle into something that fits, not without adjustment, not without the occasional friction of 2 people who are both accustomed to doing things their way, but with the goodwill and attention that make adjustment possible. Cecil was a careful man, careful in the best sense. He paid attention. He remembered what she told him. He noticed when she was having a bad day and responded to it neither with forced cheerfulness nor with anxious hovering, but with the simple, useful presence of someone who was there and was not going anywhere. She learned things about him, too. She learned that the again she had heard months ago in the conversation about being careful where he put his feet was a reference to a property he had tried to build in Missouri 6 years before. A piece of land he had bought and worked for 2 years before a legal dispute with an adjacent landowner, built on fraudulent claims that had eventually been proven in court, but not before the process had drained his savings and his 2 years of work had resulted in him losing the land and his financial footing. He had spent the following years moving because being still felt, for a while, like the thing that had cost him. He told her this one evening without drama, simply, in the manner of telling her something she should know. She told him she was sorry it had happened. He said he was too, and then he said that it had also led him here, which he found on balance acceptable. She had looked at him for a moment, and then she had gotten up and kissed him because sometimes that was the right response, and she had learned to act on the impulse. The summer of 1880 was hot and hard-working, and full of the kind of satisfaction that comes from a ranch, running well from animals that are healthy and grass that is managed properly, and water that runs where it should, and a structure, the whole complex living structure of a working piece of land. that is sound. Cecil's garden bed, planted from the catalog seeds, came in spectacularly, including things she had not grown before. A variety of squash she had not seen, tomatoes of a kind that were sweeter than the ones she was used to, a row of beans that Pete declared the finest he had ever seen, and about which he was so enthusiastic that she gave him enough to take home for a week. She discovered in July that she was pregnant, which she had suspected for 3 weeks before she was certain. She told Cecil on a Tuesday evening, matter-of-factly, sitting at the kitchen table after supper. She watched his face as she said it, and she saw something move across it that was so complete and so unguarded that she felt her throat tighten. He sat still for a moment. Then he reached across the table and took her hand, her scarred left hand, the way he always did, because he had never once made a distinction between her hands, and held it and looked at her with eyes that were bright. "Are you well?" he said. His voice was careful. "I'm well," she said. "I'm healthy." "I've been to see the doctor." She paused. "I didn't know how I feel," he said. "Yes." He turned her hand over in his and looked at it for a moment. "Rosa," he said, "I feel." He stopped, started again. "I am not a man who cries easily. I want you to know that." "I know," she said, and her own throat was still tight. "But I might," he said, and looked up at her with a smile that was the best one she had yet catalogued, the one with the particular quality she had not been able to name until now, which was that it was completely undefended. "I might right now." She got up from her chair and came around the table, and he turned toward her and held her with his hands on her waist and his face against her hair. And they stayed like that in the kitchen in the summer evening quiet, while Theodore did his last rounds outside and Jerome curled on the porch, and the first stars came out over the Texas plain. Their son was born in February of 1881, in the heart of winter, attended by the Dry Hollow doctor and Adele Ruiz, who had appointed herself to this role without being asked, and who was in fact exactly the right person for it. He was born with a great deal of noise and opinion, which Rosa said later was entirely appropriate given who his parents were, and he was healthy and pink-faced and small in the way that all new humans are small, which is to say absolutely and overwhelmingly. And Cecil held him for the first time with the care that only new fathers understand, which is the care of a man who has just been made responsible for something completely beyond the previous scale of his experience. They named him Thomas William Collier. Cecil had asked if she wanted to use Thomas, and she had been quiet for a moment and then said yes, because Thomas Sullivan had been a good man and a good name and a good thing to carry forward, and Cecil had said nothing further except that he was honored, which was the right thing to say. Pete Garza, when told the name, was silent for a moment, and then cleared his throat with great purpose, and said that was a fine name, and made himself busy with the north fence for the rest of the afternoon, which was Pete's way of processing something that had genuinely moved him. Young Thomas was a determined child from his first weeks, loud about his needs, alert with his dark eyes in a way that the doctor said was unusual, and possessed of an enthusiasm for his father's face that Rosa found so charming it was almost ridiculous. Cecil had taken to fatherhood with the same thoroughness he brought to everything, reading about it in the way he read about everything, and then discarding the parts that contradicted what Thomas actually was and building a practice from the reality in front of him. He walked Thomas around the yard in the early mornings when Thomas was being insistent, and she could hear from the bedroom his quiet, ongoing commentary to the baby about the quality of the light or the behavior of the chickens or what Jerome was doing, and the baby would quiet and listen with apparent genuine interest. Spring of 1881 arrived with its wildflowers again, and Rosa stood in the pasture with Thomas in her arms, 5 weeks old, bundled against the morning cool, wide-eyed at the blue of the sky, and Cecil stood beside her, and they looked at the land together. It had been a hard 2 years. It had been, in ways she could not have predicted, better than any 2 years she could have designed for herself. The land was sound. The ranch was healthy. They had people around them who were real friends: Adele, Pete, the Webbs, Betsy Cole, Henry and Clara Flowers, and a handful of others who had quietly, without announcement, shifted from neutrality to warmth in the way that some people do when they see something working and want to be near what is working. The Marsh brothers were a diminished concern. Dale Marsh had left Dry Hollow in the autumn of 1880 after the deputy's report, and a subsequent incident unrelated to Rosa that had brought more official attention than Dale's temperament could comfortably manage. His brother Hector had stayed, but was a different, quieter kind of nuisance, and the Collier ranch was no longer apparently interesting to him. The Reverend Hollies had moved on to a different parish, replaced by a minister named Porter who had arrived with his wife and 2 children from Kansas, and who had heard, presumably, nothing about Rosa Sullivan, and who consequently treated her the same as he treated everyone else, which was a relief of a very particular kind that Rosa thought she would probably always be grateful for. Margaret Aldridge still had opinions, but Margaret Aldridge had always had opinions and would have opinions until she departed the earth, and Rosa had learned to treat this as a weather condition rather than a personal matter. "What are you thinking?" Cecil asked. She looked at the wildflowers and the limestone hills and the enormous Texas sky, and then at her son's face, which was turned toward the sun in a way that expressed, for a 5-week-old, considerable satisfaction with the day's arrangements. "I'm thinking that 2 years ago someone nailed a dead crow to my door, and I went and buried it under the cottonwood tree and came inside and made my coffee," she said. "And I'm thinking about where that is relative to where this is." Cecil was quiet for a moment. "Where is it?" he said. "Far," she said. "It's very far." He put his arm around her, and she leaned into him with Thomas between them, 3 people in a field of bluebonnets on a spring morning in 1881, in the territory of Texas, on 40 acres that were theirs, in a life that they had made together from the rubble of separate hard histories and the choosing of each other with their eyes open. "I want to plant more peach trees this year," she said, "along the east fence. Silas Webb says the drainage is right for them there." "Then we plant peach trees," he said, "and I want to fix the road into town properly. If we're going to use it every week, it shouldn't be a conversation with the axle every time. Also reasonable. And Jerome needs to see the vet about his back leg because he's been favoring it and I don't want to let it go through the summer. I'll take him on Thursday." She was quiet for a moment. Thomas had closed his eyes in the sun with the trusting completeness of a person for whom the world is currently exactly right. "Cecil," she said. "Yes. You moved your things into this house in January, in the middle of the winter, when everyone in this town thought I was cursed and some of them were putting dead birds on my porch." "I remember," he said. Why? She had not asked this, not exactly, not in these words. He thought about it for a moment, which was what she had loved about him from the beginning, that he actually thought about things before answering them. "Because the alternative was leaving," he said. "And leaving you was something I was not able to do and remain the person I wanted to be. The town's opinion of you did not change who you were to me. If anything," he paused. "If anything, watching you carry what you carried, the way you carried it, made you more, not less. I did not want to be someone who walked away from more." She looked at him, and she felt all of it at once. Thomas's solid weight in her arms and the spring morning and the land around her, and the fact of this man who had come from nowhere particular and found her in the middle of everything she was carrying and decided, without fanfare or performance, that he was staying and then stayed. Completely. Unreservedly. In a way that had made her feel, for the first time in a very long time, not cursed but extraordinarily, improbably, specifically lucky. "Cecil Collier," she said. "Rosa Collier," he said and smiled. The rest of the afternoon unfolded in the manner of a spring day on a working ranch, that is, despite everything, running well full of small necessary tasks and brief pleasures, and the ongoing conversation of a marriage, which is different from courtship in being less urgent and more continuous, like a river rather than a storm, and which has its own beauty that is better than the storm's beauty because it lasts longer and sustains more life. Adele came for dinner that evening, as she did most Thursdays, and Pete came, because Pete had started joining them on Thursdays without it ever having been formally arranged. And Betsy Cole came because she had been at the Webb's farm nearby and had ridden over on her brown mare. They ate in the kitchen with Thomas passed around the table, each person holding him in turn with the particular solemn pleasure that people take in holding a new and small and alive thing. And the talk was wide and easy, and covered the upcoming season's work, and something Betsy had read in a newspaper that had reached Dry Hollow by way of San Antonio, and the price of feed. And a story Pete told about his cousin Pedro that was so long and so involved that by the time the punchline arrived half the table had lost track of the beginning, which made it funnier. Cecil sat at the head of his kitchen table in his home, with his wife across from him and his son currently being held by Adele with an expression of complete authority, and he watched all of it with an expression that Rosa caught and held for a moment across the table. The expression of a man who had been, for a long time, passing through things without stopping, and who had found the thing worth stopping for and stopped, fully, completely, with no part of himself held back. She raised her coffee cup slightly across the table. He raised his. It was the smallest possible toast, seen only by each other, but it said everything that needed saying. Outside, Jerome was on the porch in his customary position. Theodore had declared his final verdict on the day and retired. The south pasture had good water in the drainage ditch. The peach trees would go along the east fence in the next 2 weeks. The north road could wait until summer for the proper repairs, but summer would come, and they would fix it, and every other thing that needed doing would get done in the order in which it needed doing, because that was how a life worked, not all at once, but 1 year and 1 season and 1 morning at a time, with enough good people around the table and enough willingness to stay. Rosa Sullivan, Rosa Collier, looked around her kitchen at the people in it and felt, cleanly and without complication, happy. Not happy in the complicated way she had described to Cecil on the edge of her property under the cottonwood tree on a November afternoon, the way that acknowledged the distance still to travel. Happy in the simpler way, the way that arrived after the distance had been traveled and looked like this. A warm kitchen and people she loved and her baby son making small, satisfied sounds in the arms of a woman who treated him like her own grandchild, and her husband's eyes across the table carrying a smile that was entirely for her. The wildflowers were done for the year, but they had been magnificent while they lasted, and they would come back in the spring, as they always came back, persistent, brilliant, completely indifferent to whether the year had been hard or easy, blue and orange and gold across the Texas plain like a promise that the land itself was keeping. In 3 years they would have a daughter, delivered on a cold January morning with the same stubbornness her parents had in equal and complementary measures. They named her Clara Adele Collier, after Clara Flowers and Adele Ruiz, the 2 women who had been the clearest voices insisting that Rosa deserved better than what Dry Hollow had been giving her. Clara Adele grew into a child with her mother's directness and her father's patience, which was a combination that would serve her well for the rest of her life. The ranch grew steadily, not spectacularly, but with the sound, sustained growth that comes from working land with intelligence and without taking shortcuts. Cecil's survey experience turned out to be more useful in ranch management than either of them had initially expected. He managed water rights with a precision that made their south pasture productive in years when neighboring properties struggled. The peach trees along the east fence grew strong and bore fruit. The garden behind the house became large enough that they sold produce to Caldwell's General Store, which was a particular satisfaction, given that Caldwell's had once declined to extend Cecil credit. Old Pete Garza worked for them for 6 more years, until his knees made the work too difficult, and then came twice a week to supervise and advise and eat dinner on Thursdays and hold an opinion on everything, which he did with great energy until he was 91 years old and died quietly in his sleep, which Pete's doctor said later was the most appropriate possible ending for Pete Garza, who had always known how to make himself comfortable. Thomas William Collier grew into a serious, curious, large-hearted boy who wanted to know how everything worked and was never satisfied with an incomplete explanation, which Cecil said was clearly inherited, and Rosa said was clearly a problem that Cecil needed to address since he had caused it. Thomas took to books early, which surprised no one, and was reading competently by the time he was 4, mostly because his father had been reading to him since birth and had apparently neglected to tell him that this was unusual for someone his age. The cottonwood tree at the edge of the property became, over the years, the place where the Collier family went to think. Rosa still went there sometimes alone, and Cecil knew this and did not follow, because he understood that thinking places are not always meant to be shared, and that respecting this was itself a form of love. She still visited Thomas Sullivan's grave, which was in the church cemetery, and she brought flowers in the spring and summer, and Cecil had once offered to come with her and she had said, "You don't have to," and he had said, "I know, but I'd like to if you'll have me." She had taken his hand and they had gone together, and he had stood quietly beside her and said nothing, and this had been exactly right. Dry Hollow changed slowly, the way all things in the West changed, not always for the better, but with a kind of inevitable movement that carried the town further from what it had been in 1879 and the particular cruelty of that particular time. The railroad came closer. New families arrived. The population grew in ways that diluted the old concentrated prejudices, not by removing them, but by introducing enough new variables that no single version of events could maintain its dominance. The story of the scarred widow and the man who had refused to be moved by what anyone said about her became, over time, one of the stories that Dry Hollow told about itself. Quietly, in the way that towns sometimes retroactively improve their own histories, claiming credit for tolerating what they had actually persecuted. Rosa was amused by this in her clear-eyed way, and she said so to Cecil one evening in the comfortable dark of their bedroom, and he laughed in the way she had always loved, the laugh that was complete and unguarded, and she laughed with him. And outside the Texas night was enormous and full of stars, and the sound of their children sleeping soundly, and the cottonwood leaves at the edge of the property moved in whatever wind was passing through, and the 40 acres of land were theirs and good. And everything that had been broken had been built into something better and truer than what it had replaced, and they were, without question, and for the rest of their lives, home.